Hello and welcome to Out of Pocket. My name is Ryan, aka Ron, and today we have another Heuristics Help.
Heuristics Help!
This segment brought to you by Trader Joe's strawberry-covered strawberry pieces or something. Not really, but they're good. Anyway, let's jump in. So if you're new, Heuristics Help is a segment where I talk about heuristics. And as a reminder, heuristics are basically the methods you come up with for a particular skill or game or life or whatever. And so in this case, Pokemon Pocket. So I have developed certain methods, certain ways of doing things that I do in Pocket, and so this is my segment where I talk about those and basically try to break down the game in that manner. So all I've done so far in this segment is intro the segment and then talk about card math, which if you're unfamiliar, basically at the end of the day, card games are just math and then they look cool. So in Pokemon, like, everything breaks down to math. I bet you if you talk to DNA, who makes the game, or Pokemon as a whole, who makes the card game, like, if you ask them how they make the cards, it's just they have numerical value on the back end, I'm very confident, and then they kind of build around that. So when they make a card like Hydreigon, for example, they probably know they're breaking their own math. And they're doing that for a purpose because they're trying to influence the game in certain ways. That is my guess. And so that's the first reason I like to know card math, because it kind of gets me into the mind of the developers a little bit. Not that I will ever develop a game, maybe I will, but regardless, it's interesting to me. And the second reason, and the most important reason, is because competitively, is because it kind of gives you a baseline for what cards are good without even, like, when I look at a new set, I can know right away by doing the math if a card in a vacuum is a good card. And then, of course, you can evaluate on synergy and other things of that nature. But at the end of the day, I like to know immediately if a card is good, because it helps me determine how I'm going to build my decks and if a card is worth putting in a deck. A lot of this is intuitive, right? Like, speaking of Hydreigon, we know intuitively Hydreigon's really good, but it's helpful for me to math it out, because then I have a really concrete way of knowing why it's good and mathematically how good it actually is compared to the average. So with all that said, if you care to check out any of my past videos, feel free to do that. I'm planning to do this math segment and then one more math segment next month, and then plan to move into other things like deck building and synergy, why I like disruption and certain forms of disruption I don't prefer, and things of that, just a variety of things. But we're planning to look today at baby math and mega math to kind of complete the overview of the variety of Pokemon types in the game. So let's get to it. All right, if you're unfamiliar, this is my heuristics guide, which I have built for Pokemon Pocket because I really like to think through my hobbies and games in kind of an analytical way, and this helps me document my thoughts. And so if you want more information, see my first video on the Heuristics Help playlist, the introduction. It is currently 20 pages long. I think it was 23 at some point, but I've shifted a few things and whatever. But anyway, we're gonna start at the babies, because they're babies. All right, so we go to our handy card math section here, and we click on baby Pokemon, and boom, babies. All right, so if you are unfamiliar, here's a very brief thought or summary on my math. And I would say to some degree Dina's math as well. DNA's math, forgive me. I think it's DNA. So it's very basic. So you have your HP. Let me get my mouse. You have your why is it not showing? Anyway, you have your HP. So 80 HP up here. So you have that plus your attack, which in this case is 30, minus your retreat, which is down there at the bottom, minus your attack cost, plus any beneficial effects, minus adverse effects. Now this Hitmonchan has no beneficial or adverse effects. Beneficial effects would be things such as abilities, like the opponent can't retreat, or that would be like an effect, but our modifiers such as take 20 less damage from attacks. Adverse effects would be anything harmful, such as take 10 damage, like Solgaleo, or discard all energy, like Infernape. So that's the base. I'm not going to cover it. I've already covered that in a bunch of other videos. Well, a handful of other videos. Anyway, so Hitmonchan is our base we're looking. Before we jump into the babies, I want the base for basic Pokemon with no evolution, because baby Pokemon are basic Pokemon with no evolution. Or at least they in theory do, but they can't actually evolve in the game. Hitmonchan is our base, so the average mathematical value for a basic Pokemon with no evolution, according to my math, is 70. So Hitmonchan, 80 HP plus 30 attack is 110. I do -10 for each retreat. I think that's fair. Now, I could be off there. I've considered other things, but that's what I do right now. So -10, now we're at 100. And then long story short, I do -30 for each energy. I've experimented again with different ways to look at energy mathematically, but I've currently settled on 30 per energy. I think that's pretty fair. So Hitmonchan is 80 HP plus 30 attack, which also balances with its cost because it's -30 for the energy and plus 30 for the attack. So that evens out. And then -10 for the retreat is 70. Or if you follow the formula up there, it's 80 plus 30 is 110, -10 for the retreat is 100, -30 for the energy is 70. I wanted to give you that baseline because as I've thought through baby Pokemon, and they are more complex to me, I wanted to acknowledge to myself that 70 is the baseline value for an average for a basic Pokemon, and then take the babies from there. So without further ado, let's look at the general baby formula. Get it, baby formula? That wasn't on purpose. All right, check it out. So there's only, I believe, 10, well, let me make sure. All right, yep, so there are only 10 baby Pokemon currently in the game. We're gonna start at the bottom, but basically they're all kind of smooched up. Smoochum is one of the baby Pokemon. They're all, I'm looking at the name, they're all kind of smushed together. So we're gonna look at the bottom first, but Tyrogue, well, let me just look at the formula up here. So if you look up here, I actually have my mouse now, great. So mathematically, again, the average is 70 for a basic with no evolution. So they have 30 HP. In this case, we're gonna look at Tyrogue, so plus 20. So this would be ability or attack. In fact, it's effect or attack because no baby Pokemon have abilities yet, and there is a difference between effects and abilities. So plus 25 attack or effect average, so Tyrogue is the short end of that at 20. So 30 plus 20 is 50. Now, I'm adding plus 10 for being able to generate turn 1 or to being able to generate with no energy. I think I've considered, I would welcome thoughts here, but I've considered in light of the fact that energy I'm saying costs a normal Pokemon like Hitmonchan 30 to its math, -30. I think 0, just putting for Tyrogue, all the babies have no energy costs for their attack or their effect or whatever they're doing. And so I think just marking it as 0 is pretty effective because they're not losing that 30 energy cost for needing to spend energy. But I also think because they can go turn 1, which is a lot of the draw of baby Pokemon in the first place, that they can do something on turn 1. I'm adding plus 10 on top of not taking 30 for a cost. I'm adding plus 10 more for the fact that they can go on turn 1. Now, obviously, you're not always going to get that. Sometimes you're going to go second, whatever. Sometimes it's not going to matter all that much. But being able to generate turn 1 is a lot of the draw of babies. I could be undervaluing that potentially, but I'm doing that just mathematically as plus 10. And then lastly, I'm doing, let me get my cursor out of here. Lastly, I'm doing plus 10 for no weakness because normally Pokemon have a strength and a weakness, and so to me that is washed out. So Hitmonchan, again, for example, it's strong into, you know, whatever's weak to fighting. Usually it's lightning, so Hitmonchan is going to do 50 damage into lightning, not 30. However, because it is, oh, my mouse is here now, great. However, because it is weak to psychic, we see, I balance that out. So it has a strength into lightning, but it has a weakness into psychic. So to me, that's a wash mathematically. Now, baby Pokemon like Tyrogue have no weakness down here. They have no weakness. And so to me, that is worth some mathematical value because they can't just get one, you know, a psychic that's doing 20 or Chingling, for example, can't just one-shot Tyrogue because it's not weak to anything. And so I add plus 10 more. So here in the formula, I add plus 10 more because there's no weakness. And that's how I get to my average of 75, which is on average 5 more than an average basic non-baby Pokemon. Again, would welcome any thoughts here. I'm still not totally settled on babies because I think they're good, but they're not like They're more just good because they allow other things to be good, which we'll plan to look at in just a second. But yeah, anyway, let's look more in depth. All right. So long story short, I have a group of 4 babies that I have at 70, and then I have a group of 5 babies, 6 rather, that I have at 80. And so we're just gonna take them in chunks real quick, and then we'll plan to look at the megas after. But so first we have Tyrogue. So again, it's 30 HP plus 20 attack is 50, plus 10 for the going turn 1, plus 10 for no weakness is 70. So it's basically the simplest of basic Pokemon. It just is straight math, right? It does 70. The only reason really I've seen people play it is because it pretty effectively counters Oricorio, but other than that, it's very basic. It doesn't do anything crazy. I mean, obviously you can get it up to, you know, up to 60 damage with Lucario or put a Rocky Helmet or whatever, but in and of itself, it's very basic. All right, now moving on to the next one you can see there. So we have Igglybuff. So we have 30 HP plus its 10 attack, plus 20 for its effect. So I will plan to get into this next month, but for each effect, like Asleep, Confuse, Burn, whatever, Poison, I have put a mathematical value based on either how much damage it's doing or how much it seems like DNA is valuing it mathematically via looking at other cards that are similar and averaging it with other similar Pokemon. And so all that to say, I value Sleep at 20. Now this is one of those things that's to some degree subjective in terms of competitive play, because like Swablu, for example, with Altaria, puts Pokemon to sleep. And so a lot of people competitively value that over the 20 damage of the other one, even though again, that would be an example of where I think the math is 20 on a sleep. Let me pull that up real quick. So for example, this Swablu is 50 HP, 20 attack, 1 retreat, 1 cost. This Swablu is exactly the same, except instead of doing 20 damage, it puts your opponent to sleep. And so that's a lot of the reason right there I value sleep at 20. Now, a lot of people value this ability, or in our case, Igglybuff's ability, of sleep higher than that, because they're like, well, it gives me a 50% chance to, you know, high roll my opponent and just win the game. And that's fair. But mathematically, I would say like there's a 50% chance you do nothing, and thus you literally do nothing, and it's worth 0. And there's a 50% chance you put your opponent to sleep. Now, is that on average worth 40? And therefore they're valuing it at 20? Maybe, I don't know. But that seems to be how DNA values it. So all that to say, Igglybuff, we see here, we have so 30 HP, if you're following my little chart up there, 30 HP plus 10 attack, plus 20 for the effect of Asleep, plus 10 for the no weakness, and then I've explained this before, but minus 10 because it's colorless. So it's not, so it has no weakness, yes, but because it's colorless, it also has no strength. And so it can do 10 damage, but it can never do 30 damage because it's colorless. And so I always take away, for my math, 10 from colorless Pokemon because they have no strength. And that's how Igglybuff gets to 70. All right, Elekid is exactly the same as Tyrogue. It's 30 HP, 20 damage, and then, you know, no retreat, no weakness, no cost. So it's the exact same thing as Tyrogue. However, it does 20 damage to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. Now, I value mathematically doing damage to the bench exactly the same as doing damage to the active. So here's one example. Pheromosa, if we do the math, it's 70 HP plus 20 is 90, minus 10 for the retreat is 80, minus 30 for its cost is 50, and then it does 20 damage to your bench, and so that now it's back up to 70. So I value it exactly the same as normal damage. And so because of that, Elekid is also worth 70 like Tyrogue. Now, you will see Elekid occasionally in decks because they want to hit the bench. And the only reason I would say Elekid could be valued higher than Tyrogue is because of Cyrus. But I'm not evaluating Elekid in light of Cyrus, I'm evaluating it independently. And so therefore, I would say it's exactly the same as Tyrogue, because yes, you have extra reach, you can hit the bench, but you can't hit the active. And sometimes that's going to cost you. And sometimes they don't have a bench. But Tyrogue, on the other hand, can't hit the bench. So sometimes that's going to cost you. So really, it's just a matter of synergy in terms of determining if you want Elekid or Tyrogue or whatever, because mathematically, I would say they're exactly the same. So There you go. All right, Cleffa. This one could be a little contentious as well because I think it has a strong effect. But again, we have the 30 HP. I'm saying plus 20 for its effect. So now we're at 50. Plus 10 because it can do this effect turn 1, and then plus 10 for no weakness. So now we're at 70. The reason I'm saying 20 for its effect, which is put a random Pokemon from your deck into your hand, again goes back to other cards that they have done. All right, so here we go. Check this out. So you have an Eevee, has 60 HP, 20 attack, 10 retreat, 10 cost. Or sorry, one. Let me try again. 60 HP, 20 attack, 1 retreat, 1 cost. Now you look at this Eevee, it's 60 HP, 1 retreat, 1 cost. The only difference is you put a random Pokemon from your deck into your hand instead of doing 20 damage, which is exactly what Cleffa does. They also seem to be valuing this Eevee the same, which is just instead of putting a Pokemon from your deck in your hand, you draw a random card. So they seem to also mathematically value drawing a card and putting a random Pokemon from your deck in your hand the same. Now, obviously, there's different competitive viabilities to those two things, and I would argue getting a Pokemon is generally going to be more valuable than just drawing a random card. Not always, but probably often, depending on the circumstance. And so, you know, you could argue that the other Eevee is more valuable than this one. However, mathematically, I believe DNA values them exactly the same given their heuristics on their cards. Now, maybe they're just like, nope, the other one is just better. We just chose to give it 60 HP anyway, but I think they're valuing it the same in light of the whole game. Which leads us back to Cleffa and why I'm saying its effect is worth 20, which is where I get it to a total math of 70. So again, it's 30 HP plus 20 for its effect of putting a Pokemon into your hand, plus 10 for being able to go turn 1, and then plus 10 for no weakness. I can't get my mouse. And so there's Cleffa. All right, let's move into the 80s. All right, I would bet money this could be contentious if people watch it, but here we go. All right, I should say before I go that these are all in alphabetical order, so that was true of the 70s also. So I'm not saying, oh, Azurill's the best baby Pokemon in the game. These are all 80 according to my math. So let's look at Smoochum. So we have 30 HP, plus I'm saying 40 attack average. I'll plan to talk about that in a second, and then plus 10 for no weakness. So the reason, well, where's my mouse? Yeah, plus 10 for no weakness. The reason I'm not adding plus 10 for going first is because Smoochum's attack says this attack does 20 damage for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So I don't think there's a world in which Smoochum can actually do damage by going first. So it's one of the few baby Pokemon that is literally useless going first. Okay, so the reason I'm saying 40 attack on average is because I have assumed that my opponents are going to have an average of 2 energy on their active Pokemon when you swing at them. So for things like Tapu Lele, for things like Alolan Raichu, for things like those that are dependent on Indeedee, that are dependent on your opponent's energy, my assumption is that they're going to have 2 energy on their active Pokemon. Actually, I'm going to move Smoochum down. I'm going to say 30 on average because I think there will be times where I've done some thought with Tapu Lele, so I'm going to say 30 average. So I'm going to move it down to the 70. But anyway, so I'm going to say 30 average. I just removed it up there. But basically, so I think Smoochum, you know, like because it doesn't do anything at the beginning of the game, and because it's a baby Pokemon, so it's going to be able to attack early and only get 1 attack off, like there's at times your opponent might not have energy, or it might have 1 energy or whatever. And so it'll probably average more closer to 30 average damage instead of 40. It really just depends, but it's yeah, it's not a bad Pokemon. It's just kind of like a one-shot and then it's dead, and it can't go first, which is part of the issue with it. So we'll move Smoochum down, but there's Smoochum. It almost has potential, just not quite. All right, moving on. So we have Pichu. So Pichu has 30 HP. I'm saying 30 for its ability to generate energy, and then plus 10 because it can do that on turn 1, and plus 10 for no weakness. So its ability or its effect, gosh, I need to be consistent. All right, so its effect says take a lightning energy from your energy zone and attach it to one of your bench basic Pokemon. Long story short, I value energy generation at 30. That seems to be fair in light of things that I've mathed out. Now we'll plan to look at that next month, but yeah, it seems you could value it higher potentially. It also can only generate for basic, and so you could take away points for that. I have taken away points for that in the past, but because it's a baby, I think you can kind of cancel that, because if you start with it, you're almost guaranteed having a basic to go to. So I could be mathing these wrong because at the end of the day, I'm saying all of these Pokemon are only 10 above the average for basic Pokemon with no evolution. And you could say they're a lot higher than that potentially, but I'm not really sure where the numbers would come from. And so I've thought about it a decent amount, you know, like should I add plus 20 for being able to generate turn 1? Should I add more for being able to generate energy, etc., etc.? But I think this is pretty fair, and ultimately baby Pokemon are good because of the supporters they have around them. And so there's Pichu. Mantyke and Magby are functionally the same. They do the exact same thing. They just generate water and fire respectively instead of lightning. So there's Mantyke and there's shiny Magby. So, you know, they do the same thing just for different types of Pokemon. So there's those. Let's move on to Chingling. All right, everyone's favorite baby Pokemon, arguably, except maybe the energy generators. And so Chingling says 30 HP and then 10 damage. So looking at the formula, plus 20 for its effect, plus 10 for turn 1, and plus 10 for no weakness. So I'm saying its effect that your opponent can't play items next turn from their hand is worth 20 damage. Now here's the thing, I'm getting that partly from like Vikavolt. I don't know if there's another one that doesn't allow your opponent to play items. Cryogonal, I think, just came out, does that. There might be another, I'm not sure, but I think this effect is fairly worth 20. But the thing is, it's worth a lot more in Chingling than it is in Vikavolt, because Chingling can on turn 1 lock your, or turn 2, lock your opponent out of a lot of things, namely Pokeball and Rare Candy, that Vikavolt is probably not going to be able to. And so I am valuing it on Vikavolt and Chingling at 20, but you can make a very good argument that on Chingling it should be worth a lot more because of the fact that it can turn 1 lock your opponent out of Pokeball and Rare Candy. So yes, I could be undervaluing, but I'm trying to be consistent across my math. And if I'm going to value it Vikavolt at 20, then I should value it Chingling at 20. The only way I can make an exception mathematically, heuristically, is to say, well, because it's a baby Pokemon, it should be valued more. And I could do that. That could be fair. But for the sake of consistency, I'm not going to do that right now. Now, I know because Chingling can slot in any deck, you know, it's very good, right? And so a lot of people have played it, they've slotted it in different decks. It seems like it's a little less popular right now in this season. I don't think it's like totally busted by any means, but it's a very relevant card. But you also have to think, if, you know, Pokeball or Rare Candy, let's say Pokeball and Rare Candy didn't exist, or there were items that, there was no item that was like really, really good like those two, Chingling would not be that good. It's just because it's dependent on the items in the game. So because Pokeball and Rare Candy are so good, that's the only reason really that Chingling is good. But because those exist, Chingling is good. And so, but again, from a designer perspective, I'm just evaluating mathematically, not in light of all the other cards in the game. And so because of that, I think this effect during your opponent's next turn, they can't play item cards from their hand, is, I think, in general worth 20 on Vikavolt, on Cryogonal, on Chingling. But Chingling obviously uses it the best because it can lock out your opponent early. So that's how I get there. Please feel free to leave your thoughts on that, but that's where I'm at. All right, lastly, and kind of leastly, but I do think this is a strong Pokemon. It's just not seen a good deck yet, and maybe it never will. I don't know. Maybe it's just not relevant, but mathematically, I think it's pretty good. Azurill, looking up there, we have 30 HP plus 40 for its effect. I'll plan to get to that in a second, and then plus 10 for no weakness. So I'm not giving it plus 10 for going turn 1 because, again, to my knowledge, you can't possibly get hurt on turn 1, like if it's your turn. And so therefore adding a mathematical value to Azurill for going turn 1 is fundamentally useless because it doesn't do anything turn 1. So I'm saying 40 for its effect. Its effect is heal 50 damage from one of your benched Pokemon. The reason I'm saying 40 up there, you see, I'm saying, so for healing, I do just the number. And so it's healing 50. And so I evaluate that as 50. Now I could be I've thought about if I'm overvaluing healing on all of my cards. I don't think so, because there are times where healing is worth a lot more, and there are times where healing is worth a lot less. So I think it's fair to evaluate healing at base value. So in this case at 50, but that would put Azurill at 90. I think the fact that it can't heal itself should be minus value. So I put basically 50 for the fact that it can heal any of your other Pokemon, but -10 because it cannot heal itself. Now, you could argue that's redundant and stupid because Azurill has 30 HP, and so does it really even need to heal itself? Like, why would it ever heal 50 from itself? That's a fair argument, but you could also say -10 for the fact that it has to be active and has to use its effect to heal damage. So regardless, I think, you know, to be honest, putting it at 90 would make no sense mathematically, even though the effect is strong. And so I needed to give it some level of detriment somewhere. And I think, at least for now, being able to say -10 because it can't heal itself is fair. But there's other things you could say. The reason I'm not giving it -10 for being colorless is because it doesn't attack. And so if it doesn't attack, then it can't hit strength anyway. And so there's no point in me taking away value because it's colorless. So there's that. You could definitely argue a lot of these. I'm not sold on my baby math right now, or really any of it. It's kind of an evolving process, but I think Azurill is good, and you could argue it. And I mean, you could put it like Charmander, Mega Charizard EX, you know, and like just put Azurill and like something that can help take care of Oricorio, and then boom, you suddenly are just making up the damage Charizard is doing to itself at the expense of a point and an attack. But nonetheless, if you could go like, I don't know, it would be a weird strategy, but if you could go Charizard kill, and then boom, you take a hit, and then boom, you bring in Azurill and heal, and then boom, I mean, it's a little clunky. And I think that's a lot of the problem with Azurill. I don't know what the best way to do it would be, but, and again, I could be overvaluing it, but I think healing 50 is pretty strong. It just maybe needs the right deck. Or maybe it's not as good as I think it is. So we'll see. Let's move on to Megas. All right, let's start at the bottom. This is obvious. So just for context, I would say the average of the 5 basic Mega Pokemon in the game right now is 179. I know that's very specific, but that's just happens to be how it's mathematically worked out in my math. Let's start at the bottom. So we have Mega Latios. It's so bad. Spoiler, I am planning to do a tier list next week on the worst Mega Pokemon in the game, and it will make an appearance if I'm able to put that out. So let's look at it. So 180 HP plus 160 attack, that is 340. Minus 10 for each retreat, so we're down to 320, minus 120 for the cost because it's 30 for each energy, and then I add an additional 30 because it has 2 energy types, so that's 120. So now we're down to 200. And then discard all energy from this Pokemon, I'm saying is minus 50 because I'm saying minus 10 for each energy discard. This is off the back of other cards as well, but I think it's minus 10 for discarding an energy from yourself. So that's 10 for each, so 1, 2, 3, that's 30. And then minus 10 more because there's 2 energy types, so another minus 10 is minus 40. And then because it says discard all energy, that's another minus 10, so minus 50, which brings you down to 150. So Mega Latios is abysmal. It's one of the worst cards they've ever printed. All right, made it a little bigger there. So now we have Pinsir. Pinsir is 4 points below the average, but it's not good. So we have 170 HP up here, plus 115 attack average. Plan to get to that in a second. Minus 20 retreat, 10 for each retreat, and then minus 90 for total energy cost because 30 each is 175. Now, I will say again, I am not differentiating in my math between colorless and grass, though I know that is relevant, and maybe I will one day, but because I only run 1 energy dex at this point, I'm not differentiating for myself. But you could add additional points of value in the positive for a Pokemon with colorless energy. I may do that one day, but that day is not today. Probably. So the reason I'm saying 115 attack average is because this effect says flip a coin. If heads, this attack does 70 more damage. The average of that is 35 because if you get heads, you do 70. If you get tails, you do 0. You average out, it's 35. So 80 plus 35 is 115. And that is how I get to 175 total. All right, this one is very interesting. So we have Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan a lot of people have been playing recently, and a lot of people are saying it's really good. And again, this would be one area where you could say, oh, well, because it's colorless, it should get more mathematical value. And perhaps in the grand scope of the game, you're right. But I'm not doing that again for my math, because in my decks, I only do one energy decks. And I'm not evaluating the game from a total meta perspective, but rather just if I were to put this in my deck, what is it worth mathematically? And at that point, I don't care what energy type it's using, because it's only going to use whatever energy I've told the deck to use. So Kangaskhan I have at 180, which is about the average for the 5, and it's a bit of a puzzle, but let's look at it. So we have 180 HP plus 120 attack because its effect double punching family says 80 attack. However, this attack is used twice in a row, so the second attack does 40 damage, so that's 120 total, which brings us to 300, and then I say minus 30 for the retreat because it's 10 for each retreat, so now we're at 270. And then I say minus 90 for the cost because 30 each, so now we're down to 180, and then minus 10 for colorless, which brings you down to 170. And then my little blurb up there says, I think giving plus 10 to its attack, or I'll put effect. I think giving plus 10 to its effect is fair because 25% of the time seems reasonable for how often it will hit 2 Pokemon. So if we go back to Kangaskhan, it says this attack is used twice in a row, the second attack does 40, and if the first attack knocks out your opponent's active Pokemon, the second attack is used after your opponent chooses a new active Pokemon. So if you're unfamiliar, Kangaskhan, if your opponent's active Pokemon has 80 or less HP, you can do 80, knock them out, and then do 40 more to the next Pokemon that comes in, which is the only effect like it in the game. It's very cool. It has very interesting synergy and just effect with, you know, offensive things and defensive things. So if you use red, for example, that does plus 20 to your opponent's EX Pokemon, it does plus 20 on the first hit and plus 20 on the second hit. If you're using Giovanni, plus 10, plus 10. But on the other side, if you're, you know, attacking into a Rocky Helmet, you take minus 20 on the first and minus 20 on the second. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Long story short, I am giving it plus 10 to its effect because, like I said, I think 25% of the time seems reasonable in terms of how often it's going to use this effect. Maybe I'm off there, but and if it's more, it's more. But 25% of the time, I think it will knock out the active and then do more damage to the next one. That's why I'm saying plus 10 for its effect, because 50% seems too high on how often it'll knock out and then do 40 more. So anyway, all that to say, 180 is where I have Kangaskhan. All right, second to last, we have Mawile. So I have Mawile at 190. Which, again, to be fair, I'm not evaluating in the scope of the whole game. So if I were, yes, Kangaskhan is more playable because it's colorless, but just on raw power, I think you can say Mawile is better. Yes, it's more niche for sure by a long shot, but just on power, I think it's better mathematically, not synergy, just math. So Mawile is 170 HP. Plus 90 attack on average, I'll plan to get into that, minus 10 retreat because only one retreat, and then minus 60 cost because 2 costs for energy, that's 190. So reading my little blurb up there, I said, I think assuming it stays in the active for 2 swings, average of 90 attack, I just formatted to make it a little more clear. So I said, I think assuming it stays in the active for 2 swings, which is an average of 90 attack, is reasonable, therefore 190. So Mawile's effect says, until this Pokemon leaves the active spot, this Pokemon's Heat Up Crunch attack does plus 30 more damage. The effect stacks. So if it does 60, if it's still active, it does 90 next turn. If it's still active, 120, 150, etc., etc. Now, it is weak to Sabrina, to Repel. That just makes it really bad. But I think on average, whether you build Mawile 19 Trainer or you build Mawile, you know, in some total of building decks with Mawile, I think it's fair to say that it's on average going to swing for 90. That's really the question I'm asking, is what is it going to swing for on average in the grand scope of the game? I'm guessing, but I think it's fair to say on average it will swing for 90 because sometimes it will be more than that. Maybe a little more often it'll be less than that. Sometimes it will be that. And so I think it will average out to around 90 per attack. And that's how I get to the math. All right, lastly, and obviously first, we have Mega Absol. So mathematically 170 HP plus 80 attack is 250, minus 10 for the retreat is 240, minus 60 for the cost is 180. I think its effect averages to 20. I think that's fair. And so that gets it to 200. Now, again, I am making the assumption that its effect is averaged worth 20 points of mathematical value. You could argue more. I understand that there's context to this, but again, I'm trying to basically put everything on the baseline and just evaluate it in numbers terms and not in terms of like, well, I played this game and it did this, and like, yes, I understand that, and that's fair, but I can't take that into account mathematically. I have to evaluate, like, in total, what is it going to average? What does DNA seem to think it averages, etc. So its effect says your opponent reveals their hand, choose a supporter card you find there, and discard it. Now, sometimes that will win you games, and sometimes it will do absolutely nothing. And so that's where I think evaluating it at 40 is fair. Now, if it just said, like Gengar, your opponent can't play supporters next turn, I evaluate that effect at 30 because I think it's better than, say, Chingling, call back to the video, your opponent can't play items. In general, not playing supporters is stronger than not being able to play items because supporters are worth, I would say, twice as much mathematically as items. And so, but all that to say, I think if Absol finds a supporter and discards it, I would say that's probably worth 40, but sometimes it will find nothing, or sometimes it will find a useless supporter. So I think average is 20, but I still have it mathematically as the strongest basic Mega Pokemon. Now let's go to stage 1. All right, there are only, move that up a little, there are only 4 Stage 1 Mega EX Pokemon at this point. As of the recording of this video, Medicham, I think it's called, has not come out yet. It might be out by the time this video drops, and I'm gonna plan to do a short on it, I think, with the math if you're curious. So anyway, but let's start with Mega Steelix. My average for Mega Stage 1 EX Pokemon is 227.5. So how about that for exact? There's only 4 of them, so here we go. So Steelix I have at the bottom. It is 220 HP plus 120 attack. That is 340 minus 10 for each of these retreat is, now we're down to 300, minus 120 for its cost, now we're down to 180, and then I say plus 20 for its effect and plus 10 for no weakness and up to 210. So its effect here says, during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon takes minus 20 damage from attacks and has no weakness. So the minus 20 damage, again, I'm just taking that at face value, so that's plus 20 to its overall math. And then the plus 10 for no weakness, I'm saying, I think plus 10 because sometimes it's going to be worth a lot and sometimes it's going to be worth nothing. In fact, a lot of times it'll be worth nothing. You could even say it's worth 5, but I don't like to go 5s in general. Occasionally, but I like to do 10s in general, and so I'm saying plus 10 because no weakness. I think that's somewhat relevant. You could say plus 5, but that's how I get to 210. Let's go on to the next one. All right, Mega Lopunny EX is, I have it 230, which is a little above average. So Steelix, I am saying, is the worst and the only one below average of the current Stage 1 EX Pokemon. And this is one example of where, like, some people saw Mega Lopunny and were like, oh, it sucks. But, like, if you evaluate it, again, strictly mathematically, it's not bad. In fact, spoiler, I have it tied with Mega Gyarados, which is next, and not too far behind what's number 1. But all that to say, it's pretty decent mathematically. And so that could have keyed people into, hey, maybe this Mega will be decent. And so looking at Steelix, like, some people, put out video, oh, Steelix is busted. And I was like, no, it's not. It's probably gonna fade from play because I knew mathematically it was not good. And it didn't seem to even have that good of synergy. Like, yes, it has Brock and that helps make up some of its math, but like it doesn't have like a pairing or whatever that's really gonna buff it over the edge. If it had like a Stage 1 Steel Pokemon or something that was really, really good, then maybe the synergy would get it over the top. And obviously Brock is really good, but just in and of itself, it's not that strong. So there you go, for whatever that's worth. All right, so Mega Lopunny, we have 190 attack, 90 HP, 90 attack average because it flips 2 coins and it does 90 for each head. So it can do up to 180 or it can do 0. So the average is 90. So now we're at 280, minus 10 for the retreat is 270, and then minus 60 for the energy cost, and now we're down to 210. And then the reason it's 230 is because the second line of text here says your opponent's active Pokemon is now confused. I believe, again, like Sleep, they evaluate confusion at 20. And so therefore, that is what gets Mega Lopunny up to 230. All right, our friend Mega Gyarados, so also at 230. So we have 210 HP plus 140 attack. We're at 350 minus 30 retreat, we're down to 320, minus 120 for its cost, now we're down to 200, and then it says discard the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. I am saying I think that effect, again, let me be consistent. I'm saying I think that effect is worth 10 for each discard. So I believe I have evaluated discarding the top card of your opponent's deck at 10 apiece in general, according to other such cards. There might only be like one like Nuzleaf, I think, maybe one other, I'm not sure. But regardless, I think that effect's worth probably 10 because it's more from your hand, I would say. And maybe, or Shiftry is what I'm trying to say. Maybe Shiftry is hand, I don't remember, but Shiftry is indeed hand. Okay, so I don't know if there's other effects from deck, there might be, but regardless, I think each one of those discards is worth 10, and that's how I get to 230, because it's discarding 3. Sometimes it's going to be really useful, sometimes it's not going to be that useful. So there's Gyarados. Let's go to number 1. All right, Mega Altaria, obviously number 1. So it's 190 HP plus 120 attack on average. I'll plan to get to that in a second. Minus 10 retreat, minus 60 for the energy cost is 240. Now, its effect says this attack does 30 damage for each of your benched Pokemon. So if you have no bench, 40, 1 bench, 70, 2 bench, 100, and 3 bench, 130. Now, when we all think of Mega Altaria in battle, if you play competitively, we think of it as 130 damage Pokemon, because it usually is. However, I have determined mathematically, I don't think it makes sense in the grand scope of the game to say that, oh, well, it's always gonna do 130 mathematically. I don't think that's accurate. However, I think Pokemon like this, so Suicune's another one, Arceus is another one, Pokemon that are reliant on your bench for damage are typically going to build in a way that makes that as effective as possible, meaning they're typically going to have more than, 3 extra bench Pokemon. Altaria often has like 6 total basic Pokemon in its deck, often, or somewhere around there, maybe 7 even. Sometimes 5, I think it's 6 usually, but regardless, usually it's going to get that 130, but occasionally it's not. And so I have decided all Pokemon with an effect like this, I'm going to take away 10 damage from their maximum output. So Altaria's maximum output is 130, so I'm putting it down to 120. I also do that with Arceus. Arceus's max potential is 130, so I average it at 120. I think it's fair to take a little bit away mathematically, because it will not always be at the max, but I think it's fair to keep it close to the max because you're almost always going to build around that effect. So there's Mega Altaria number 1. Lastly, let's look at stage 2. All right, let's start at the bottom, Mega Pidgeot. So, and one of the most complicated ones, I didn't realize there were 8 Mega Stage 2s, but there are. The average I have for the Stage 2s is 268.13, which, spoiler, is heavily tilted to the top. So Pidgeot is pretty far below rate. So again, this would be another one. When it came out, people were like, oh, is it going to be good? And I was like, mathematically, no, it's terrible. And so I made a short, you can look at it, where I said, I think people will use it for a little while and then it will be decent just because it's one of the newest megas, but then it will fade and eventually it will just totally fade, and it has already totally faded to my knowledge. So, which again is partly because of the math. Like, it's just, if you do the math, it's just not that strong. So this would be another example of mathing. So let's look at it. So 210 HP plus 100 attack, minus 20 retreat, minus 90 cost for the energy, minus 10 colorless is 190. I don't know how people talk for this long. I'm too introverted for this. Anyway, all right, so its effect says flip 3 coins. For each heads, discard a random energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. If all of them are tails, this attack does nothing. So when I'm presented with a new effect or a new ability, I have to figure out how to consistently work its math into my heuristics. DNA has already done this. They've already done the math, and they've, put out cards accordingly, but because I'm receiving their math, I have to then, synthesize what I'm trying, when something, I can't think of the word, but when you become a part of, I have to incorporate it into my heuristics. And so let me read my little paragraph here. It says, the effect I think is worth 35 total, minus 10 because it can do nothing, though a low chance, plus 45 because of the energy discard, which is valuing each discard at 30, max of 90, minimum of 0, average is 45. So let me explain that. So its effect says discard a random energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. If all of them are tails, this attack does nothing. All right, I just changed this around. So I evaluate these things sometimes late, or like I haven't looked at this in a little while, and I think to be fair, I need to lessen some points. So now I have it at 210 instead of 225, which puts the average around 265 for all the Stage 2 EX. Basically, I think its effect is worth 20 now. Let me read this again. Minus 10 still because it can do nothing. But for the energy discard, I think each energy discard for your opponent should be worth 20. I'll very quickly say, if you discard for yourself, I think it's worth minus 10. If you discard for your opponent, I think it's worth minus 20. And so I won't go deeper than that right now, but I think I was valuing the energy discard too highly. And so long story short, it can discard, to summarize this little thing I wrote here, sometimes it's going to discard 3 energy from your opponent, which I would say mathematically is worth 60. Sometimes it's going to do 0. The average is 30. So I'm doing plus 30 for that effect on average, because that's on average, it will discard 1.5 of your opponent's energy, which amounts to 30 according to my math now that I just edited. Part of that is in light of Beedrill. If you're familiar with Beedrill, it says when you attack, you discard an energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. I have valued that at 20. I've gone back and forth on 20 or 30. I think 20 is better. And so therefore, in light of that, to be consistent, I'm putting Pidgeot to that same heuristic. So anyway, so that's plus 30 for that, which would bring it up to 220, but then minus 10 because the end of Pidgeot says if all of these are tails, not only do you do no damage, but do you take no energy away from your opponent, you also do no damage. So I could even be being generous by only taking away 10, but there's not a good chance you flip 3 tails. But I think it needs to have some negative value, so minus 10. So again, to summarize, you have 190 for the total math, plus 30 for the energy discard effect on average, which is up to 220, and then minus 10 because if you flip 3 tails, you do nothing. So that brings us down to 210. Sorry, that was complicated. All right, next we have Mega Venusaur at 240, which is 25 points shy of the average. This might cause some people to go, huh? But again, this is math. This is not synergy. This is not counting Ivysaur. This is just math. So let's look at it. 240 HP plus 120 attack is 360, minus 40 retreat is 320, minus 120 for the energy cost is down to 200, and then I'm saying plus 20 for poison is up to 220, and then plus 20 for sleep is up to 240. So in and of itself, Venusaur is not very good. That is my contention. Mathematically, I think it's pretty obvious. The reason Venusaur is even remotely playable is because of this card. So Ivysaur, its evolution previously, says for 1 energy, you can take 2 energy from your energy zone and attach it to this Pokemon if you are in the active and you swing. So what this fundamentally does for Venusaur is it gives it plus 60 value. So if we go back to Venusaur and we say, so you add 1 energy to Ivysaur, that's 1 energy, minus 30. And then its effect says you add 2 energy to it. And so now you're at 3. You only have to add 1 more energy from the energy zone to the Ivysaur or the Venusaur now, depending on if you evolve or not. So if we consider that Critical Bloom is an attack that only needs 2 grass energy from your energy zone, which is often true, then suddenly Venusaur I value mathematically at 300, which is extremely good. But in and of itself, it is not very good. The only thing that makes it good is Ivysaur. If that didn't make sense, feel free to ask comments, but basically I'm saying Ivysaur subtracts 2 energy cost from Venusaur because of its effect, and so that would put it up to 300 if you evaluate Critical Bloom at only 2 cost. But in and of itself, it is 4 cost, and so that's 240. You'll notice in these also that Mega Venusaur, its HP is not uncommonly similar to its total math, and so Venusaur is 240. I'm evaluating it at 240. Pidgeot was 210, I evaluated it at 210. That's not true all the time, of course, or even maybe often, but sometimes it is. All right, moving on to Mega Ampharos, we have 210 HP plus 140 attack average. I'll plan to get to that in a second. Minus 20 retreat, minus 90 cost is 240. So its effect says one of your opponent's benched Pokemon is chosen at random 3 times. For each time a Pokemon was chosen, also do 20 damage to it. So I'll type it out here. All right, so basically when I have an effect that says do X amount of damage to randomly to your opponent, so Wugtrio, Rayquaza, trying to think if there's another example, but I think there is, but those two come to mind. I mean, Macargo, Dragonite, that's the other big one. When there's an effect that says do X random damage to your opponent, I take that total damage, so in this case it's 60 because it does 23 times, and then I subtract whatever the amount is one time. So 20 is the amount, it does 23 times, so I say that's a total of 60, but for the random cost, I take away 20 from that total, which is down to 40. I do the same for Dragonite, I do the same for Wugtrio. You can look at my old heuristics videos. So that's how I get to a total of 240 for Ampharos. I would say it's not bad, but it's not that good. Moving on. All right, Swampert. Here's another example of a Pokemon that early on people are like, oh, Swampert, some people. And I was like, I don't think so. And so let's look at the math. 230 HP plus 150 attack is 380, minus 30 retreat is 350, minus 90 cost is 260. I said I think the ability balances, so therefore it's a total of 260. So its effect says discard 2 random energy from among the energy attached to all Pokemon, yours and your opponent. All Pokemon, yours and your opponent's. So when we have an effect like this that equally can affect you and your opponent positively or negatively, I just balance it mathematically because there's a 50% chance it's their energy, 50% chance it's your energy. So therefore, I think that equals out, and that's how I get to 260. So again, for Mega Swampert, like it's not bad. And one thing that is relevant here is synergy things and breakpoints. So 150 is an important breakpoint. So that's one of the reasons Swampert is not bad, is because though it mathematically might be equal to the next Pokemon, which is fundamentally a lot worse in the meta, the reason it's not bad is because it has synergy and it has breakpoint. So it can do 150, which is an important breakpoint. That's what, from a competitive perspective, would make it better than the following Pokemon. All right, and the following Pokemon is what has been touted as probably the worst Mega from Mega Rising. And from a competitive perspective, that very well could be accurate. Because if you just consider Mega Blastoise's first attack as being its only attack, then yes, it's not very good. But here's how I get to what I get to. So its first attack, so long story short, if you haven't seen my old videos, I take the first attack and then I take the second attack. So fundamentally, I'm considering it to have 2 attacks. And then I take the average of that and then I subtract retreat. So for his first attack, triple bombardment, 230 plus 130 is 360. 230 plus 130 is 360. Minus 30 retreat is 330. Minus 90 cost is 270. And then if I were saying that's its only attack, which functionally it is oftentimes, then I would take the retreat. So minus 30 retreat, now we're at 240, which is really bad. However, I am taking into consideration everything on the card here, not just function, what functionally is probably going to happen in a tournament or in a competitive setting. And its effect says if this Pokemon has at least 3 extra water energy attached, this attack also does 50 damage to 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. Now, if we take the first attack as 270 and then the second attack, fundamentally it's a second attack because it might as well say, it might as well be a different attack that says 6 cost and 130 plus 50 damage to 2 your opponent's bench. Then I'm saying for that second attack, it's 230 HP plus 230 attack because it's 130 to active plus 100 to the bench, and then minus 180 cost because it would be 6 energy, so it's 30 per energy, so that's 180 total, and that would go to 280. Now, if you take the 280 for that second attack minus plus the 270 for the first attack and average those, sorry, let me back up. For the second attack, if it has 6 energy on it, I said I think it should be plus 10 mathematically for hitting 2 different bench Pokemon. So that's 290. So long story short, if you have 6 energy and you can do 50 damage to 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon of your choosing, I think that should be worth an additional 10 points mathematically, and that would get you your second attack up to 290. And so if you average those 290 and 270, you're at 280. And that's when I take away the retreat after all that is said and done. Now we're down to 250. And then again, to rehash some of my old heuristics, because it has the option of 2 different attacks, I give a plus 10 for that, which is what takes Blastoise up to 260. Now, I know that was a lot, so feel free to ask questions or think about that or whatever, but basically, if you average the fact that it can do 130 or the fact that it can do 130 plus 100 more to your opponent's bench, but 2 times, I think it averages at 260, which is the same as Swampert. However, it is very uncommon that you're going to get practically to that 6 energy needed to get triple bombardment's effect online, which means functionally Blastoise is usually going to be just base 130, in which case again the math would be 230 HP plus 130 attack is 360 minus 30 retreat is 330, and then minus the 90 cost is 240. So on average, typically it's going to be 240, which is not good, and the breakpoint is not very good at 130. But if you factor in this effect, and I do for math because I have to, because I'm evaluating the card holistically, not on practicality, then I think on average it is 260. But obviously you're only, probably going to see this online if you high roll a Misty and have Mantyke or Jellicent or whatever and just get a bunch of energy somehow. So there's Blastoise. All right, these should go quick. This is one reason I think Charizard is pretty good is because of the math here. So we have Charizard Y, we have 220 HP plus 250 is 470, minus 20 retreat is 450, minus 120 for the attack cost is 330, and then minus 50 damage to itself is 280, which is strong. That's above the average. Now, the reason you could say Charizard is not that good is for a couple of reasons. Number one, competitively, if it has to go through 2 or 3 Pokemon, that's a lot of damage it takes to itself. But I'm not counting that in the math. I think the biggest reason you could say mathematically it's worse than this is because a lot of times this 250 is too much, right? So a lot of times 200 or 210 or something is just going to kill whatever it needs to. And if you evaluate Charizard as having 210 attack, for example, then I would take away 40 from its overall math, which would also put it down to 240 with Blastoise functionally. Now the 250 is relevant sometimes for other megas or whatever. I only megas I think at this point really, but that 250 can be relevant. And so I'm just looking at the card on base value, but you could say, okay, well it's worse because on average it's only gonna need like 210, not 250. Therefore 250 is overkill. But on base, 280 is where I put it. All right, moving on to our friend Blaziken. I also have this at 280. So 210 HP plus 120 attack is 330, minus 10 retreat is 320, minus 60 costs is 260, and then I'm saying it now. Its effect says discard a fire energy from this Pokemon. Your opponent's active Pokemon is now burned. I think burned is worth 30, so now we're up to 290, and then because it discards a fire energy, now we're back down to 280. So I think Blaziken is mathematically equal to Charizard. However, they have different strengths and weaknesses. So sometimes Blaziken, is going to be a lot better because it's faster and it burns your opponent, and the energy discard is often not going to matter because of Flame Patch, etc., etc. But sometimes Mega Charizard is going to be better because it one-shots everything. So, and it has Charmeleon, which is, again, I talked about Ivysaur with Venusaur. Charizard has Charmeleon, which is also important. The thing to remember though with stage 1 evolutions like Magnezone, for example, when you're running Magneton or running Charmeleon with Charizard or Ivysaur with Venusaur, is you're giving up rare candy for those decks. Obviously you can do Quick Grow and Venusaur, but you're giving up an important card. So there is a pro and con is what I'm trying to say. So anyway, Blaziken I have valued mathematically the same as Charizard. Obviously this doesn't count synergy with Flame Patch and things of that nature, but There's Blaziken. Let's go to number 1. All right, Mega Gardevoir, I have at number 1, and I have it at number 1 by a long shot. Mathematically, I tried to fight this functionally, but I don't think I can. So let me explain. And this is what's skewing the average significantly upward. So let's do the math. Mega Gardevoir 210 HP plus 110 attack is 320, minus 10 retreat is 310, minus 60 cost is 250. So even without its effect, 250 is not bad. Now its effect says take 3 psychic energy from your energy zone and attach it or them to your psychic Pokemon in any way you like. Now, I am evaluating this effect at 110, which could be way too much, but this is what I say. I think the ability is fairly worth 110 because I'm saying plus 90 for the energy generation, which for context, I always evaluate energy generation as plus 30 unless there's a reason to subtract something, but in general, plus 30. So it's generating 3 energy, so I'm saying 30 for each energy. And then I'm saying plus 10 because it can give energy to itself. So since I do this with Leafeon also. So I'm saying plus 10 because itself is an option, and then plus 10 because it can put it on any Pokemon. So like base Gardevoir both of them can only put on specific Pokemon. So one can generate only to the active, the other can only generate to the bench, to one bench Pokemon. Gardevoir can literally put these 3 psychic energy that I am valuing at 90 anywhere. It can put it on itself, it can spread it however it wants to, and so I am evaluating its effect at 110. Therefore, Mega Gardevoir total at 360, which I recognize is significantly higher than anything else. Charizard, Blaziken, Blastoise, Swampert, Ampharos, Venusaur, Pidgeot. There are a lot of other factors to consider, but in a vacuum mathematically, this card is very, very, very powerful. Even if I only value the energy at like 20 each or something, it's still over 300, which is just better than anything else stage 1 or stage 2 in the game, and in many respects better than really any other Pokemon mathematically, in a lot of respects. But it has some weaknesses. It only does 110, so that's important competitively. It requires something on the bench that can, accept that energy. So if it has nothing on the bench that it accepts that energy, or it's not relevant, or Diantha's not in play or whatever, then it's only at 250. So if you take away its effect, it's only worth 250, which is not that good. So keep that in mind. If it's only just attacking for 110 and that's it, then it's not very good. But once you factor in its effect, and if you assume its effect is going to be worth something or worth what it says, then it's just worth a ton, astronomical. But there will be times where its effect is worth nothing because you don't have anything to attach to, or because you already have all the energy you need, or because Diantha has already been played, or whatever. Maybe more accurately, it's most often going to be worth 40 because 30 energy for taking 1 energy to itself for Diantha, and then 10 for being able to generate to itself. Or really, if you just said what I typically say with like Hydreigon or Flareon or other Pokemon that can attach energy to themselves, I usually evaluate each energy or Leafeon at 30. And so if you just evaluated Fantasia Force as plus 1 energy to itself for Diantha and evaluate it like that, then I would say it's worth 280, which is now on rate with Charizard and Blaziken. However, because I have to, just holistically take its effect and say, this is what I think it's worth in a vacuum, I'm saying it's worth a lot more than that. But you do have to consider when you're building decks functionally what is the math, but just in a vacuum, Mega Gardevoir is, I would say, mathematically one of the most broken Pokemon in the entire game of Pokemon Pocket. All right, that was it. Thank you for coming to my long TED Talk. If you did, if you're not a developer, this may or may not be interesting to you. If you are a developer, ideally it is interesting. And maybe we can talk about more things in the comments or whatever. But yeah, I find it interesting. I'm trying to get all of these thoughts. This is part of the reason I started the channel, to try and get all of these thoughts I have out onto paper, and then, in my heuristics guide, and then into content for the sake of just if anyone else finds it intriguing or useful. So thanks for watching if you did. I am glad to talk through these things, and feel free to let me know if you have comments. Would be happy to hear them, like what you think, or if you would tweak anything. And yeah, that's it. So have a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. See ya.